bond between mothers and daughters has inspired a wealth of dramatic literature. Funny, poignant, and very familiar, mother-daughter stories fill anthologies and reading lists, drawing readers and listeners irresistibly. Welcome again to Trinity Rep Radio Theater, a production of Trinity Repertory Company and WRNI. Trinity Rep Radio Theater is a monthly exploration of dramatic literature featuring members of Trinity Rep's resident acting company. Today's program features stories and poems about mothers and daughters. I'm your host, Bob C., and joining me is Kurt Columbus, Trinity Rep's Artistic Director. Hello.
Hello, Bob.
And three members of Trinity's resident acting company, Janice Duclos, Barbara Meek, and Ann Scaria. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Bob.
Bob, I wanted to point out that we have a special guest with us today, Molly Allen. Molly is a high school student at LaSalle Academy, and she's also a participant in our Young Actors Studio and a member of our G-Tech Ambassadors, and she's going to be with us today performing in our stories.
Well, welcome, Molly. Kurt, tell us about today's program.
Well, Bob, we were thinking about mothers and daughters a lot because on our stages right now we have a new play called Memory House by Kathleen Tolan, which Annie is actually starring in. And it's a really remarkable piece. It's gotten such incredible response from our audiences because it's about the relationship between a mother and a daughter. And we wanted to say some stories that actually delved into that complicated and sometimes impossible and sometimes incredible relationship between a mother and daughter. And since Janice and Barbara and Annie are all daughters and mothers in some cases, yes, that we thought that they would be the appropriate people to read with us today. We're going to hear four short pieces about mothers and daughters ranging from 1895 to 2006 by Jamaica Kincaid, Colette, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and Jan Shoemaker. We'll also have two poems by Anne Sexton, but we're going to start with the earliest piece, which is called The Unnatural Mother by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Perkins Gilman is best known for a short story called The Yellow Wallpaper, with which you might be familiar. But she grew up in Providence. Most people don't know that, and was trained as an artist at RISD before she turned to writing. And she published this story in 1895. The other really interesting thing about her is that she was the niece of Harriet Beecher Stowe and Catherine Beecher, and she shared their progressive feminist views. So,
well, from 1895, let's hear The Unnatural Mother by Charlotte Perkins Gilman with Janice Duclos, Barbara Meek, Ann Scaria, and Molly Allen.
Don't tell me no mother that was a mother would desert her own child for anything on earth.
That was Mrs. Briggs. She had had 13 children, 5 of whom remained to bless her.
And leaving it a care on the town, too, as if we hadn't enough to do to take care of our own.
That was Miss Jacobs. She is a well-to-do old maid. Any maternal feeling Miss Jacobs might lack, Miss Briggs could certainly supply. I was a boarder from the city and their captive audience.
I should think that she might have saved her young one first and then tried to do what she could do for the town.
The youngest Briggs girl, Maria Amelia, still unmarried and in her mother's eyes a most tender infant, now ventured to make a remark.
You don't any of you seem to think what she did for all of us. If she hadn't left hers, we should have all lost ours for sure.
You ain't no call to judge, Maria Amelia. You've no children of your own. No mother ought to leave her child no matter what happens.
She was an unnatural mother, as I said to begin with.
I asked, what is the story? What did this woman do? There was no difficulty in eliciting particulars. The difficulty was rather in discriminating amidst their profusion and contradictoriness. But when I got it clear in my mind, it was somewhat as follows. The name of the much-condemned heroine was Esther Greenwood. She lived and died here in this mill village near the lake that had been dammed above the valley. Esther was the child of a heartbroken widower. He had lost a wife and 3 babies before her. This one was left him, and he meant that she should have all the chance there was.
That was what ailed her in the first place. She never knew what 'twas to have a mother, and she grew up a regular tomboy. Why, she used to roam the country for miles around in all weather like an engine. And her father wouldn't take no advice.
This topic lent itself to eager discussion. The recreant father, it appeared, was a doctor, not the resident physician, but an alien doctor possessed of views.
You never heard such things as he advocated. He wouldn't give no medicines hardly. Said nature did the curing. It's a doctor's business to give medicine. If nature was all that was wanted, we needn't have any doctor at all.
You should have seen the way he dressed that child. It was a reproach to the town. Why, you couldn't tell at a distance whether it was a boy or a girl. And he let her go barefoot till she was so big we was actually mortified to see her.
It appeared that a wild, healthy childhood had made Esther very different from the meek, well-behaved town damsels.
She was so nice to us children. She was 5 or 6 years older than I was, and most girls that age won't have anything to do with little ones. But she was kind and pleasant. She'd take us berrying and teach us new games and tell us things. I don't remember anyone that ever did us the good she did.
Maria Amelia's thin chest heaved with emotion, and there were tears in her eyes.
That sounds well, I must say. Right before your own mother that's toiled and slaved for you. She had nothing else to do but make herself agreeable to young ones. Her father never taught her to do the work a girl should. Naturally, he couldn't.
At least he might have married again and given her another mother.
I studied Miss Jacobs' expression for a moment, and concluded that if this recreant father had not married again, it was not for lack of opportunity.
Now this Esther, she wasn't like other girls. Why, she actually seemed to care more for them children than she did for beaux or anything. It wasn't natural.
But she did marry?
Marry? Yes, she finally married. After the things her father taught her, it seemed as if he'd ruined all her chances. Simply terrible the way that girl was trained.
Him being a doctor made it different, I suppose. But doctor or no doctor, it was a crying shame to have a young girl so instructed.
Maria Amelia, I want you should get me my smelling salts. They're up in the spare chamber, I believe. Look in the top bureau drawer. They must be there.
Maria Amelia withdrew dutifully, and the other ladies drew closer to me.
It's the most shocking thing I ever heard of. Do you know a father, actually taught his daughter how babies come?
All the particulars. It was perfectly awful. He said that he expected her to be a mother and that she ought to understand what was before her.
He was waited on by a committee of ladies from the church. Married ladies, all older than he was. They told him it was creating a scandal in the town. And what do you think he said?
There was another breathless silence. Above, the steps of Maria Amelia were heard approaching the stairs.
They ain't there, Ma.
Well, look in the high, boy. They're up somewhere up there. He told that committee that until young women knew what was before them as mothers, they would not do their duty in choosing a father for their children. A nice thing for a young girl to be thinking of, a father for her children. And more than that, he taught that innocent girl about the bad disease.
He did. It got out, too, all over town. There wasn't a man here who would have married her after that. As if any man alive would want to marry a young girl who knew all the evil of life. I was brought up differently, I assure you.
Young girls should be kept innocent. Why, when I was married, I knew no more what was before me than a babe unborn. And my girls were all brought up so, too.
As Maria Amelia returned with the salts, Mrs. Briggs continued more loudly.
But she did marry, after all. And a mighty queer husband she got, too. Mr. Greenwood was an artist or something. They do say she met him first out in the hills, them two traipsing about all over, him with his painting things. They married and settled down to live with her father.
They seem very happy together.
Happy? Well, they might have been, I suppose. It was a pretty queer family, I think. They got on all right for a while, but the old man died, and those two, well, I don't call it housekeeping, the way they lived.
No, they spent more time out of doors than they did in the house. She followed him around everywhere, and for open love-making.
She had that child, and it was just shocking to see how she neglected her from the beginning. She never seemed to have no maternal feeling at all.
But I thought you said she was very fond of children.
Oh, children, yes. She'd take up with any dirty-faced brat in town, even them Canucks, taking a whole swarm of the mill hands' young ones on picnics and open-air school, as she used to call it. But when it come to her own child, why, she never had no baby clothes for her, not a single sock.
The child died?
Died? Oh, dear, no. A great strapping girl she is, too, and promising to grow up well, thanks to Mrs. Stone's taking her. It's a mercy to the child that she lost her mother. However, how she ever survived that kind of treatment beats all. Now, the way it happened was this. They lived above the valley, nearer to the lake than the village, and Mr. Greenwood was away and was coming home that night, driving along the lake road. She must have walked up to the dam to look for him.
Maybe she saw him coming with the team clear across the lake. Maybe she thought he could get to the house and save the baby in time.
You see, 'twas the time of that awful disaster. Well, you've read of it, likely. That destroyed 3 villages. Well, she got to the dam and seen that 'twas given way, and she just turned and ran. Jake Elder was up on the hill after a stray cow, and he seen her go. He said he never saw a woman run so in his life. And if you'll believe it, she run right by her own house, never stopped, never looked at it. Just run for the village.
She may have lost her head with the fright, but that wasn't like her.
No, I think she'd made up her mind to leave that innocent baby to die. She just ran down here and give warning, and of course we sent word down valley on horseback, and there was no lives lost in all 3 villages. She started to run back as soon as we was roused, but 'twas too late then.
Jake saw it all, though he was too far off to do a thing. He said he couldn't stir a foot. It was so awful. He seen Mr. Greenwood's wagon driving along as nice as you please till it got close to the dam, and then seemed to see the danger and shipped up like mad. He was the father, you know. But he wasn't quite in time. The dam give way, and the water went over him like a tidal wave. She was almost to the gate when it struck the house and her. And we never found her body nor his for days and days. They was washed clear down river.
Well, their house was strong, and that child was found swimming around in her bed, most drowned, but not quite. The wonder is she didn't die of a cold. Must have a strong constitution.
Well, now, Mother, it does seem to me that she did her duty. If she hadn't given warning, all 3 villages would have been cleaned out. 1,500 people. If she'd stopped to lug that child, she couldn't have got here in time. Don't you believe she was thinking of those Millhands' children?
Maria Amelia, I am ashamed of you. A mother's duty is to her own child.
And here's her child, a burden on the town. She was an unnatural mother.
This is Trinity Rep Radio Theater, and we've just heard The Unnatural Mother by Charlotte Perkins Gilman with Janice Duclos, Barbara Meek, Ann Scaria, and Molly Allen. I guess this raises the question, what is a natural mother?
Yeah, it really does. We've talked a lot about the theme in this story seems to be, is it more important to care for your own children than it is to care for the village of 3 villages filled with 1,500 people? And what does that have to say to us as, contemporary people?
Really, I mean, what is a mother's instinct? Is it toward her own or toward all? And she's such an interesting character, this Esther Greenwood that everyone's talking about. I mean, she seems so contemporary in her views, and this was written in
1895.
I know, that's incredible.
Yeah, it's just amazing to think of a woman who's bringing the children out and teaching them in an open-air school, and it's really a very contemporary feel to that.
And despite all of the criticism by you, Mrs. Briggs, and you, Miss Jacobs, and Maria Amelia keeps defending this woman, and you can't really find anything that she's done that's wrong, even though you're complaining about it. The results appear to be good.
Yes, indeed. But she was raised by that father, so you have to, I always give credit to the father because she didn't have a mother.
That's right.
Yeah, the other issue that I find really intriguing is the issue of having knowledge that makes you unfit. We're still arguing over sex
right.
education, and we're
Even though
still
this
arguing.
is a Victorian story.
It's just unbelievable to think how much this resonates now, isn't it?
How little we've changed,
Yeah,
right, Annie?
right.
Yeah. I'm just thrilled to find, I think Janice or Emily, maybe Emily Atkinson, our other producer, found this particular story. And it has such a remarkable electric charge for us today. It's really quite great. So,
Kurt, tell us what we'll hear next.
oh, well, next we're going to go to one of my favorite authors, the salacious Colette. This is not a salacious story at all, but she's one of my favorite authors for that reason. This is a story she wrote in 1922 about her daughter, who was known as Belgazou, and it's called The Sempstress. And then we're going to pair it with an Anne Sexton poem, the first of two that we're going to read today. It's called Pain for a Daughter, since they both touch on similar ideas.
The Sempstress by Colette, with Janice Duclos, Barbara Meek, Anne Scaria, and Molly Allen, here on Trinity Rep Radio Theater.
Do you mean to say your daughter is 9 years old and she doesn't know how to sew? She really must learn to sew. In bad weather, sewing is a better occupation for a child of that age than reading storybooks.
9 years old and she can't sew. When she was 8, my daughter embroidered this tray cloth for me. Look at it. Oh, I don't say it's fine needlework, but it's nicely done all the same. Nowadays, my daughter cuts out her own underclothes.
So my friend said to me, I meekly poured all this domestic wisdom over my daughter Belgazou. You're 9 years old and you don't know how to sew. You really must learn to sew. Flouting truth, I even added, when I was 8 years old, I remember I had embroidered a tray cloth. Oh, it wasn't fine needlework, you understand, I dare say. And then, in bad weather, she has therefore learned to sew. And although with one bare sunburnt leg tucked beneath her, and her body at ease in its bathing suit, she looks more like a fisher boy mending a net than an industrious little girl. She seems to experience no boyish repugnance. Her hands, stained the color of tobacco juice by sun and sea, hem in a way that seems against nature. Their version of the simple running stitch resembles the zigzag dotted lines of a road map. But she buttonholes and scallops with elegance, and is severely critical of the embroidery of others. She sews, and kindly keeps me company if rain blurs the horizon of the sea. And it sometimes happens that a quarter of an hour before dinner, she sits solemnly down with a square of material between her fingers. Then my friends applaud.
Just look at her. Isn't she good?
That's right. Your mother must be pleased.
Her mother says nothing. Great joys must be controlled. But ought one to feign them? I shall speak the truth. I don't much like my daughter sewing. When she reads, she returns all bewildered and with flaming cheeks from the island where the chest full of precious stones is hidden, from the dismal castle where a fair-haired orphan child is persecuted. She is soaking up a tested and time-honored poison whose effects have long been familiar. If she draws or colors pictures, a semi-articulate song issues from her, unceasing as the hum of bees round the privet. But Belgazou is silent when she sews, silent for hours on end, with her mouth firmly closed, concealing her large, new-cut incisors that bite into the moist heart of a fruit like little saw-edged blades. She is silent, and she... Oh, why not say the word that frightens me? She is thinking. A new evil? A torment that I had not foreseen? Sitting in a grassy dell or half buried in hot sand and gazing out to sea, she is thinking, as well I know. She thinks rapidly when she's listening, with a well-bred pretense of discretion, to remarks imprudently exchanged above her head. But it would seem that with this needle play she has discovered the perfect means of adventuring, stitch by stitch, point by point, along a road of risks and temptations. Silence. The hand, armed with the steel dart, moves back and forth. Nothing will stop the unchecked little explorer. At what moment must I utter the halt that will brutally arrest her in full flight? Oh, for those young embroiderers of bygone days, sitting on a hard little stool in the shelter of their mother's ample skirts. Maternal authority kept them there for years and years, never rising except to change the skein of silk or to elope with a stranger. What are you thinking about, Belgazou?
Nothing, Mother. I'm counting my stitches.
Silence. The needle pierces the material. A coarse trail of chain stitch follows very unevenly in its wake. Silence.
Mother?
Darling?
Is it only when people are married that a man can put his arm around a lady's waist?
Yes. No. It depends. If they're very good friends and have known each other a long time, you understand. As I said before, it depends. Why do you want to know?
For no particular reason, Mother.
2 stitches. 10 misshapen chain stitches.
Mother, is Madam X married?
She has been. She's divorced.
I see. And Monsieur F., is he married?
Why, of course he is. You know that.
Oh, yes. Then it's all right if one of the two is married?
What is all right?
2 depends.
One doesn't say to depend.
But you said just now that it depended.
But what has it got to do with you? Is it any concern of yours?
No, Mother.
I let it drop. I feel inadequate, self-conscious, displeased with myself. Oh, I should have answered differently, and I could not think what to say. Belgazou also drops the subject. She sews, but she pays little attention to her sewing, overlaying it with pictures, associations of names and people, all the results of patient observation. A little later will come other curiosities, other questions, and especially other silences. Would to God that Belgazou were the bewildered and simple child who questions crudely, open-eyed. But she is too near the truth, and too natural not to know as a birthright that all nature hesitates before that most majestic and most disturbing of instincts, and that it is wise to tremble, to be silent, and to lie when one draws near to it.
The Seamstress by Colette with Janice Duclos, Barbara Meek, Anne Scaria, and Molly Allen. And now we'll hear Pain for a Daughter by Anne Sexton, read by Anne Scaria.
Blind with love, My daughter has cried nightly for horses. Those long-necked marchers and churners that she has mastered, any and all, reining them in like a circus hand, the excitable muscles and the ripe neck, tending this summer a pony and a foal. She who is too squeamish to pull a thorn from the dog's paw, watched her pony blossom with distemper, the underside of the jaw swelling like an enormous grape. Gritting her teeth with love, she drained the boil and scoured it with hydrogen peroxide until pus ran like milk on the barn floor. Blind with loss all winter, in dungarees, a ski jacket, and a hard hat, she visits the neighbor's stable, our acreage not zoned for barns. They who own the flaming horses and the swan-whipped thoroughbred that she tugs at and cajoles, thinking it will burn like a furnace under her small-hipped English seat. Blind with pain, she limps home. The thoroughbred has stood on her foot. He rested there like a building. He grew into her foot until they were one. The marks of the horseshoe printed into her flesh. The tips of her toes ripped off like pieces of leather. 3 toenails swirled like shells and left to float in blood in her riding boot. Blind with fear, she sits on the toilet, her foot balanced over the wash basin, her father, hydrogen peroxide in hand, performing the rites of the cleansing. She bites on a towel, sucked in breath, sucked in and arched against the pain, her eyes glancing off me where I stand at the door, eyes locked on the ceiling, eyes of a stranger. And then she cries, "Oh, my God, help me!" Where a child would have cried, "Mama," where a child would have believed, "Mama." She bit the towel and called on God, and I saw her life stretch out. I saw her torn in childbirth, and I saw her, at that moment, in her own death, and I knew that she knew.
Anne Sexton's poem, Pain for a Daughter, read by Anne Scoria, here on Trinity Rep Radio Theater. Well, we've just heard 2 moving pieces that seem to have the same theme, that at some point mothers, parents sadly lose their place as the primary influence on their children's lives. Is that how all of you feel after reading this? So eloquently put.
I just feel sad mostly after hearing. They're just both simultaneously poetic and clear-eyed visions of mother-daughter relationships at moments of change, right?
And what really rings true for me is the minute observations that these mothers make of their daughters. And they're both seminal moments in that they see that their daughters are becoming women. They're becoming adults. But all this time, they're really looking for it. They're looking for that moment. And the way they observe the tiniest changes, the tiniest silences. And that rings so true for me, and I find that so very touching.
Yes, and what gets me every time in the Anne Sexton poem is that as a mother, you see your daughter becoming you, taking your place on the planet in a wonderful way.
That's really interesting, Annie. I haven't thought about that, but is that the difference between mothers and daughters and fathers and sons? I mean, right, where the central myth is a kind of Oedipal myth where the son takes over from the father. This is a process replacement, right, rather than an overthrow, if you will.
Oh, that's interesting.
I hadn't occurred to me.
And what's interesting about both of these works is that the mothers are observing this. They're not commenting directly to their daughters.
Right.
Yeah. And you must allow them that distance. I mean, they need that distance to not tell you and not let you into all of their thoughts. And you know they're thinking.
Mm-hmm.
You hope they are.
Yeah.
And you hope you're there when they want an answer, and you can give them a sensible, honest, truthful. This is what this lady
Yes, and
said,
that protective
truthful
instinct.
answer.
Yes, and the protective instinct is still there, and it's so strong. But like you said, Barbara, they have the feeling of, oh, ask me, ask me, or a little bit of, oh, don't ask me, don't
Because
ask me,
they don't want to ask. I mean, I don't know if,
Right.
but you want to be available for the asking. And then when you see that they did it anyway, even though they didn't ask, they did the right thing. They made the right choice. That's what they get from you, I think, is how to make good choices. And I don't know.
It's really it's interesting, Barbara, because the thing that I notice in the hearing of both of these stories, and particularly the Colette story, is that they're both about subtext. They're both about what's unspoken, if you will. The Sexton poem, perhaps to a lesser extent, although, Annie, your reading of that, especially at the end, is just so extraordinary because the layers of emotion are all in there. And I felt the same thing at the end of the Colette story. She wants them to she wants Belgazou to ask, but she's not going to sit there and say, what do you need to ask me? She's waiting for it to come out. So that's all in the subtextual reading. And that, Bob, is what great actors can bring to stories like this.
Another thing about the Colette story, there's a lot of advice that Colette is giving about raising her daughter. And we've heard that in the first story as well. Everybody has advice about how to raise children.
Yeah.
But how true and effective is a lot of it.
Well, and in fact, our next piece, that's a very good segue. Our next story is all about advice. It's called Girl by Jamaica Kincaid, and it was written in 1979.
Our next story, Girl by Jamaica Kincaid, read by Janice Duclos, Barbara Meek, Ann Scaria, and Molly Allen, here on Trinity Rep Radio Theater.
Wash the white clothes on Monday and put them on the stone heap. Wash the color clothes on Tuesday and put them on the clothesline to dry.
Don't walk barehead in the hot sun.
Cook pumpkin fritters in very hot, sweet oil.
Soak your little cloths right after you take them off.
When buying cotton to make yourself a nice blouse, be sure that it doesn't have gum on it, because that way it won't hold up well after a wash.
Soak salt fish overnight before you cook it.
Always eat your food in such a way that it won't turn someone else's stomach.
On Sundays, try to walk like a lady and not like the slut you are so bent on becoming.
You mustn't speak to wharf rat boys, not even to give directions.
Don't eat fruits on the street. Flies will follow you.
This is how to sew on a button. This is how to make a buttonhole for the button you have just sewed on.
And this is how to hem a dress when you see the hem coming down. And so to prevent yourself from looking like the slut I know you are so bent on becoming.
This is how you iron your father's khaki shirt so that it doesn't have a crease.
This is how you iron your father's khaki pants so that they don't have a crease.
And this is how you grow okra far from the house, because okra trees harbors red ants.
This is how you sweep a
This
corner.
is how you sweep a whole house.
This is how you sweep a yard.
This is how you smile to someone you don't like too much. This is how you smile to someone you don't like at all.
This is how you smile to someone you like completely.
This is how you set a table for
This
tea.
is how you set a table for dinner.
This is how you set a table for dinner
With an important guest.
This is how you set a table for
This
lunch.
is how you set a table for breakfast.
And this is how to behave in the presence of men who don't know you very well. And this way they won't recognize immediately the slut I've warned you against becoming.
Be sure to wash every day, even if it is with your own spit.
Don't squat down to play marbles. You're not a boy, you know.
Don't pick people's flowers. You might catch something.
Don't throw stones at blackbirds, because it might not be a blackbird at all.
This is how to make a bread pudding.
This is how to make pepper pot.
This is how to make a good medicine for a cold.
This is how to make a good medicine to throw away a child before it even becomes a child.
This is how to catch a fish.
This is how to throw back a fish you don't like, and that way something bad won't fall on you.
This is how to bully a man.
This is how a man bullies you.
This is how to love a man, and if this doesn't work, there are other ways, and if they don't work, don't feel too bad about giving up.
This is how to spit up in the air if you feel like it. And this is how to move quick so that it doesn't fall on you.
This is how to make ends meet.
Always squeeze bread to make sure it's fresh.
But what if the baker won't let me feel the bread?
You mean to say that after all, you are really going to be the kind of a woman who the baker won't let near the bread?
Girl by Jamaica Kincaid, read by Janice Duclos, Barbara Meek, Ann Scaria, and Molly Allen. Well, with all of that advice, I guess my question is this poor girl going to listen? Is she going to be able to...
And it never ends, the advice. No matter how old you get, how grown, how withered you become, your mother still gives you that advice.
That is interesting, Bob. This is really in the voice of this piece, and the way that Janice and Emily have said it for us to read is in such contrast to the Charlotte Perkins Gilman story, right? Mm-hmm. Because it literally says there are so many ways to hear these voices. Even if you're just hearing your one mother's voice, that voice sounds different at different times, right?
Yes.
And the mother's, of course, goal is to the best for her child, but I wonder if sometimes it's a bit too much.
Well, we don't tell them that, do we?
You just can't help yourself.
Well, anyone who thinks mothering is not a job has only to listen to this list of advice and all the things that mother has to do and that she is passing on to her daughter. Yeah. And she has to be a wizard in psychology and medicine and washing and you name it. And these are all things that you have to pass on to your daughter.
It's really interesting, Bob. This is I'm going to move us on to our next story, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Because when the information is passed along, what happens when the relationship shifts and you, as the daughter, are no longer the daughter, but become the mother to your mother? And so we really wanted to include a story that spoke to those issues as well. And the next piece is by Jan Shoemaker, and it really deals with how that relationship changes over time.
Let's hear Where the Water Is by Jan Shoemaker, read by Janice Duclos and Barbara Meek.
A year has passed since my father died, and my mother, who was in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, moved in with my patient husband Larry and me. My sweet, exasperating mother got the guest room at the end of the hall. My teenage daughter Anna got to share the bathroom, and I got a spiffy new therapist named Stuart. In the weeks following the funeral, my sister Sue and I labored with help from our families to steer our mother along the twisting corridors of Alzheimer's. Every day was like waking up in a strange old hotel with high ceilings, the kind that you find in big cities. You step tentatively out of your room and go searching for the elevator that will bring you down to the familiar street. But that elevator isn't so easy to find. Everywhere you turn are hallways and more hallways, snaking and braiding and dividing up there on the 10th floor. You realize with certainty and horror that you could wander those featureless halls forever without touching the earth again. I am not a church person by nature, but I decided to start taking my mother to the Presbyterian church near my house. She is a lifelong Presbyterian, and I figure the familiarity of the liturgy might make her feel more comfortable and secure in her new surroundings. And it does, a little. My mother often has a hard time following the bulletin and finding the hymns in the hymnal, and I sometimes lean over and help her. Other times, usually on mornings when she has asked me again and again who I am, even asked me if I am her mother, I sit tight, irritated, and let her wander through the pages while the congregation reads in unison. One morning at breakfast, she asked me for what seemed like the 100th time if I was her mother, and I snapped, "Do I look like I'm 115 years old?" That's how mean I can be. One of the uncomfortable things about living with a person who suffers from Alzheimer's is that it makes you confront your own character flaws. Just when you thought it was more or less clear From all the times you've given money to public radio and boycotted Walmart, that you were the incarnation of Albert Schweitzer or Gandhi or both, you find out you're really just a slightly bitchier version of Martha Stewart. Your well of compassion, which was never very deep to begin with, is now just an empty cistern. A few weeks after my mother moved in, I dropped her off at my sister's house so that I could go to hear environmental writer and activist Terry Tempest Williams speak on the campus of Michigan State. I and a small crowd of other liberals, all chastened by the outcome of the 2004 presidential election, crept out through the March sleet to listen to Williams talk about sustainable living in the global age. We assembled in a large anonymous lecture room, and Williams lit a candle and began to speak about community and living in the service of something beyond ourselves. She quoted Henry David Thoreau, "Let us consider the way we spend our lives." And she described the rain that comes after periods of drought, even in the desert where she lives, and the life that appears in puddles within hours of a deluge. I thought about how dried up and brittle I was feeling inside, like seasoned cordwood, when what I wanted was wetness, fluidity. And I did feel a keen desire to serve something beyond myself. I merely needed the capacity to do so, which could come only from buoyant, sloppy, perilous, life-sustaining love. Inside my dry, kindling self, I felt the possibility of a damning conflagration, and I realized that hell, like the kingdom of God, lies distinctly within. And I recognized sin as a condition of self that draws a border around its private appetites for time, money, power, and excludes everything and everyone else. But when the Presbyterians bow their heads to pray for forgiveness for their sins, which they seem quite bent on doing much of the time, my private thoughts pull themselves up and bellow, "Sin? Sin? Excuse me, but we didn't send a tsunami to wipe out countless lives, including children and babies. And we didn't invent cancer or schizophrenia or muscular dystrophy or Alzheimer's, but we are here living with them and trying to do a decent job of helping each other through this obstacle course of horrors, even if we do screw up a lot of the time. So if God is watching, I sure hope he, she, it is saying, that's a fine job you're all doing." But as I said, after going to my own church, which is what I felt I'd done with Terry Tempest Williams and that mob of damp and disheartened liberals, I reconsidered the problem of sin. I realized that steps needed to be taken and that I had to take them. I considered the way I'd been spending my life lately. Anyone who didn't look too closely might have told you I was doing a fine job fulfilling a daughter's duties. My sister and I even hired an aide to spend several hours a day with my mother. We had assembled a medical team of ologists to oversee her body and a legal financial team to oversee her assets. But somehow I knew I had to do something more, something that for me was radical and terrifying. I had to make the dense and rigid borders of myself permeable. I had to stop recoiling from and deflecting my mother's pain and instead let it in where it would reshape my life and claim my time and energy. You can't imagine how I didn't want to do that. But I suspected it was just that sort of full communion that would lead me to where the water is. I wasn't exactly sure how to tap into this subterranean sea that I sensed, or rather hoped, lay beneath my crusty separate self, like an aquifer beneath a desert. I had no divining rod except a raggedy sort of faith in the power of love, the pure stuff, not the compromised cupfuls we flavor and bottle and hand out in small portions and sometimes take back. It was becoming clear that I had to do less managing of my mother's affairs and more listening. To that end, I set myself deliberately along a new course. No more sitting my mom in the next room with the television on while I washed and peeled and stir-fried vegetables for dinner as if she were company, an elderly auntie too fragile to pitch in. I invited her into the kitchen, handed her a paring knife, and sat her down at our old farm table to slice peppers. Enough pretending that all was well. It wasn't. Might as well admit it. She had sustained staggering losses. I asked her, "What do you miss the most, Mom?"
My house. The girls. Ken.
Ken was my father. The girls were a group of 80-year-old women she'd known since they'd worked together at the Standard Oil Company in the 50s. They still met for lunch once a month, though naturally they were down a few girls.
Especially Kathy.
Kathy was her best friend. Against my better judgment, I found my mom's small voice irritating. Imagined I heard in it an implicit reproach. A good daughter would find the time to drive me home once in a while. I bit my lip and chopped Vidalia onions. Nothing happened quickly. In May, we bought antique lawn chairs and painted them purple and sat in them in the garden each evening. We walked our old dogs together. But I struggled to open myself and continued to feel crowded by my mother's enormous needs and the claims they made on my life. And then a godsend. My sister and I cleaned out Mom's house so that it could be rented, coming away with odd bits of furniture, stacks of books, and a few boxes of mementos to be sorted out later. When later came, I discovered among the old passports and birth certificates my mother's wedding picture. She is beautiful in it, standing alone at the bottom of a stairway in her satin dress. But most of all, she is young, younger than my own daughters. I hung her portrait in my house just as I'd found it, discolored at the edges, its frame rickety and peeling. I study it almost daily, and here is what I'm finding. The girl in that photograph awakens my tenderest, most protective instincts. I want to take her by the hand and promise that the world will be gentle with her and that she won't come up empty-handed. I will see to it. That, of course, is a promise I can't even make to my own children. But the wonder of it is that I am meeting that lovely bride now at the other end of her life. The world, as it turns out, was not gentle with her at all. But I am here to take her hand in its old woman's skin. Mother, daughter, what does it matter? The order, the age. Those people who say that life isn't perfect, well, they're right. I am still overly busy, and my mother is still often sad. But my borders, at least, have relaxed and grown noticeably porous, the way they were when my daughters were young. I'm getting better at letting my mother into my life, schlepping her along in the snow to a fundraiser for earthquake victims, sitting her down for chai at my favorite cafe, even working her into my noisy book group where she seems happy to engage in small talk. And I am surrendering my role as protector, learning to let her help me too. When I crawled out into the English ivy to be near my old dog who was dying, She ran for blankets and tissues and tea. Back and forth she went on her unsteady feet, the ivy grabbing at her ankles, but I let her care for me. Because permeable, breathing borders both let out and receive love. Oh, this has been a tough year, Mom.
The worst year of my life.
We sat there until the sun went down. Then we got up and went inside.
Where the Water Is by Jan Shoemaker, read by Janice Duclos and Barbara Meek here on Trinity Rep Radio Theater. This is such a moving and profound piece that deals really with mothers and daughters, but human relationships in a huge way. Dealing with aging parents and taking care of them, managing them, rather than being with them.
And also, I think, Bob, how the relationship changes us. I mean, that's the thing that I find incredibly moving in listening to this, is that the main character, or Ms. Shoemaker, I guess, is probably the main character. She really goes through a transformation because of her mother's illness, not in some way in which she can manage the illness, but in the way in which she can't manage the illness. And the illness just changes their relationship and profoundly changes her, I think, right?
And it's such a change for you when you reach the age where you find yourself becoming the caretaker of your parents, who were the strongest people in your life, all your life. You were the child. And now suddenly you are a parent to your parent, and that's a very hard adjustment to make. I mean, there are all sorts of emotions in there of resentment and anger, as well as the wanting to take care and wanting to love and wanting to protect. And I think she describes that journey in this story so well, about someone wanting to let all these complicated emotions really in, to take them in and then be able to live with them.
What about the discovery of the photograph, which seems to be the real turning point?
Oh my gosh, I feel the same way when I see photographs of my parents when they were young. My mother passed last year at 94, and my dad is 93.
Wow.
And, sometimes we forget that they were once young. And to look at a photograph like that and think of what they thought their life was going to become. Was it this, where they are now? Especially a parent who ends up with Alzheimer's. Is this the way they ever pictured themselves to be? And, it's difficult for them and for their children.
It's really that. My dad had Alzheimer's, and the discovery of the picture is very profound, because it's also the thing that happens with a person with Alzheimer's is that they become that young person again. In spite of themselves, they don't know that time has passed. They become unstuck in time and go back to the photograph. So you find yourself negotiating the change from, sometimes they're 7 years old when you're talking to them, sometimes they're 80 when you're talking to them, and it changes from moment to moment. So that's sort of the remarkable thing in the story as well, the recurrence of the question, "Are you my mother?" And then she snaps, "I'm not 115 years old." It's really quite remarkable.
Yes, and you're my mother, and you have been with me all my life, and you are the repository of all the memories. And now you're forgetting.
Yeah.
The other thing I like about this story is that it's Alzheimer's, so the outcome can't be successful or good in the
recovery
traditional sense.
Yeah.
But in this great moment of anguish and hopelessness, she discovers something.
Yeah.
Which makes all the difference. And that's basically opening herself up.
Yeah, the image of permeable borders is so beautiful, and the viscous, luscious water flowing in and out. And the allowing the mother to take care of her when her dog is dying, because that's how we gird ourselves. You know, we give ourselves a role, and that's the role. We're caregiver, or we're this, or we're that. And when she actually accepts something from this, allows herself to be mothered again, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing.
Well, if we can get ourselves together here, let's close our program by returning to that powerful first bond between mothers and daughters.
Right.
We're going to hear Anne Sexton's poem Mothers, read by Barbara Meek.
Oh, mother, here in your lap, as good as a bowl full of clouds, I, your greedy child, am given your breast, the sea wrapped in skin, and your arms, roots covered with moss and with new shoots sticking out to tickle the laugh out of me. Yes, I am wedded to my Teddy, but he has the smell of you as well as the smell of me. Your necklace that I finger is all angel eyes. Your rings that sparkle are like the moon on the pond. Your legs that bounce me up and down, your dear nylon-covered legs, are the horses I will ride into eternity. Oh, mother, after this lap of childhood, I will never go forth into the big people's world as an alien, a fabrication, or falter when someone else is as empty as a shoe.
Mothers by Anne Sexton, read by Barbara Meek here on Trinity Rep Radio Theater. And during the past hour, we have heard a tremendous variety of material on this subject, which, as Kurt, you said at the beginning, is complex and profound. But
well, we wanted to return to Anne Sexton at the end because she has become for us a favorite in that she talks about very real, very actual and honest and prosaic things in such a forceful and poetic way. And she has become a favorite for us because when read, when spoken by actors, she takes on all of these, her words take on all of these complicated characteristics. That's really quite remarkable. So I hope that all of the stories together actually bring us a better understanding of mothers and daughters.
I want to thank you all for a remarkable series of performances. You've been listening to Trinity Rep Radio Theater, and this program featured The Unnatural Mother by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, The Sempstress by Colette, recorded by permission of Farrar, Straus and Giroux, Girl by Jamaica Kincaid, copyright by Jamaica Kincaid, recorded by permission of the Wiley Agency, Where the Water Is by Jan Shoemaker, recorded by permission of the author, and Anne Sexton's Mothers and Pain for a Daughter, copyright by Anne Sexton, recorded by permission of Sterling Lord Literistic. Trinity Rep Radio Theater is a production of WRNI and Trinity Repertory Company. Janice Duclos and Emily Atkinson, producers, Kurt Columbus, executive producer, Joe O'Connor, general manager, and Jim Moses, sound engineer. Trinity Rep Radio Theater is made possible in part by generous support from the Rhode Island Foundation, a charitable community trust serving the people of Rhode Island. Thank you for joining us, and please tune in again next month for Trinity Rep Radio Theater. I'm Bob C.